It's an assault on everything Mahatma Gandhi stood for and preached. It's an attack on the foundations of our freedom movement, of our independence struggle, the values of our constitution. And it simply, to my mind, has to be challenged at every level. And one of the issues, therefore, is the need to rethink the global system and come up with a greater flexible thing. Because frankly, in international affairs, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Welcome to another episode of Independent Thought and Freedom, where we have conversations with some of the most interesting people around the world who are shaking up politics, society, economies, and ideas. We've had some amazing guests on this program, including The Saker, Paul Craig Roberts, Sheikh Imran Hussain, E. Michael Jones, Cynthia McKinney, and more. If you'd like to support us to reach our next goal of actually putting together live events where we bring some of my best guests side by side on one stage, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber on Patreon. You'll find the link below. Also, if you are an author or researcher with important ideas to share with the world and want to have a greater impact, I'm offering a free masterclass, 3 steps on how to leverage your intellectual authority to become a media personality. The link for that class is in the description as well. And now, on to this week's show. Welcome to this week's episode of Independent Thought and Freedom. India is the world's 3rd largest economy today, after the US and China. But it doesn't wield the political and economic power in world affairs commensurate with its weight. Compared to smaller economies such as Russia, Israel, Turkey, or even Iran, for example, let alone China, India's influence arguably pales in comparison. At a time when the world is in turmoil, from Hong Kong to Iran to Syria to Venezuela, this is significant. However, India has been undergoing a tremendous transformation domestically, with Narendra Modi and the BJP establishing its political dominance in a shift toward Hindutva nationalism. This parallels shifting political paradigms all over the world, from centrist liberalism to populist nationalism. What role, if any, will India play in the current reshaping of the world that is occurring before our very eyes? How will India reshape itself? Today, my guest can perhaps answer this question better than anyone else. I'm honored and pleased to welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament of the Republic of India since 2009 and former Minister of State for External Affairs and Minister of Human Resource Development. Before getting involved in politics, Dr. Tharoor had a most distinguished career as a diplomat at the United Nations, last serving as Under Secretary General. He came in 2nd place to replace Kofi Annan, losing to Ban Ki-moon after he was vetoed by the United States. Dr. Tharoor is also an acclaimed writer, having authored 18 best-selling works of fiction and non-fiction since 1981, and has written hundreds of columns and articles in publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, Newsweek, and the Times of India. Throughout his career, he has received too many awards to mention, but I'll just note the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the Global Leader of Tomorrow at the World Economic Forum in Davos, GQ's Inspiration of the Year Award, New Age Politician of the Year Award, Digital Person of the Year Award, Peter's Person of the Year, and it goes on and on. There will be more to come, I'm certain. Welcome, Dr. Tharoor.
Thank you, Kirk. That was a very generous introduction. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Oh, it is well deserved, and I could have gone on and on for much further, but I know both of us are pressed for time. There's so many things that we can talk about, but why don't we start with the recent debate in Parliament on the refugee bill? You participated in that debate?
Yes. Well, it's a debate that is profoundly important because of the fact that it's such a basic assault, as I said in Parliament, on the very foundations of our Constitution and the very logic of our freedom movement. You see, when India fought for freedom from the British, the freedom movement split not on ideological grounds of Marxists versus capitalists or whatever, not on geographical grounds of Northerners versus Southerners. It's split on one simple issue. Should religion be the determinant of nationhood? So those who claim that religion determined their nationhood, that was the idea of Pakistan, they formed Pakistan. And those who rejected the notion that religion had anything to do with nationhood, starting with Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Maulana Azad, Dr. Ambedkar, you name your independence hero, they all said, no, our struggle is for everyone's rights, and we will establish a country where all are free and equal. And they wrote a constitution to reflect that. So Pakistan became an Islamic republic. India defined itself as a secular state, not in the sense that it distanced itself from religion, but rather that it allowed all religions to flourish, to proselytize. Every individual had the right of worship and so on. Religion was not a litmus test for who you were in this society or in the eyes of the state. Unfortunately, what was once a fringe movement, the Hindu mirror equivalent of the Muslim League that created Pakistan, that movement grew in the last decade or two of the 20th century under a new political party then, the BJP, founded in 1980, but which was heir to this somewhat chauvinistic Hindu set of beliefs. And they've gained in popularity and success, come to power, been re-elected this year, and they are quite openly pursuing an agenda of what we know as Hindutva, which means essentially Hindu-ness, but in fact is part of a larger project of turning secular India into a Hindu state, the way in which Pakistan has become a Muslim state. It's sort of a Hindutva version of the idea of Pakistan. And that's why this debate was so important, because this bill is one piece of a larger architecture that is designed to transform India into something it has never been since independence.
Okay, there are two aspects two angles I'd like to take this toward. One is that from a personal perspective, from your own history, your involvement with the UN refugee process, I think, would provide a lot of special insight, and the protection of minorities aspect, which the BJP has emphasized, is something to look at. I suppose seeing India as a homeland for Hindus who are being repressed, if you want to say, denied human rights in neighboring countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc.
We have no problem with that. Our problem is with the exclusion of some. So
right.
when you single out specific communities and say that people who are persecuted of those faiths will be eligible for accelerated citizenship in India, and you deliberately leave out Muslims, then what happens, for example, to the Ahmadiyyas of Pakistan who are treated as Muslim in India,
Yes.
who are considered apostates in Pakistan? What happens to the Shias and the Hazaras in Afghanistan? What happens to atheists from Bangladesh? There have been atheist bloggers who have been shot. What happens to Muslim intellectuals and writers like Taslima Nasreen, Dawood Haider, who have in the past been given asylum in India? You see, it's discriminatory as a bill, and it's that discrimination that we are objecting to. On the contrary, we're not objecting to refugees getting status in India. On the contrary, we're proud of our record of granting refuge. In fact, most Hindus look back on Swami Vivekananda's famous statement in Chicago in 1893 at the First World Parliament of Religions, when he said that I'm proud to hail from a civilization that has given refuge to the persecuted of all religions and faiths. Yes. Now, had the BJP wanted to cover itself in virtue, it could have made that proposition into law, instead of which it has essentially said it will only give it if you're not a Muslim. And this gets further compounded, Kirk, by a separate and clearly related effort called the National Register of Citizens, or the NRC, which has exercised in getting people to document, to provide documentary proof that they are citizens of India. Now, the combination of the two bills is disastrous because the vast majority of Indians, particularly poor Indians, slum dwellers, village dwellers, and so on, do not have documentation. Birth certificates were not widespread in India till well into the 80s. And so many people, including in Mr. Modi's Council of Ministers today, are unable to demonstrate that they have proof that they are citizens of India, that they were born in India, when they were born, who their parents are, and so on. Now, it may seem to you to be an absurd proposition that the government would question 130 million people. But the fact is that that's what they propose to do. Very clearly, those who are excluded will now become eligible under the CAB, the Citizenship Amendment Bill that's just passed, to be excused unless they're Muslim. That means that the only people in India who risk being disenfranchised if they don't have adequate documentation are the Muslim Indians. That, to my mind, is completely pernicious. It's an assault on everything Mahatma Gandhi stood for and preached. It's an attack on the foundations of our freedom movement, of our independence struggle, the values of our constitution. And it simply, to my mind, has to be challenged at every level. We've challenged it in Parliament. I know there's a lot of disturbances and agitations in the streets right now. And then in the longer term, it's going to end up being challenged, I'm sure, in the courts.
All right. Now, I want to just add to what you're saying about India historically providing refuge. And the Zoroastrian community may have been wiped out from the face of the earth had it not been for the Parsis coming to India and the Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism. Yes, that is certainly part of India's record.
The largest refugee exodus in human history remains the 10 million East Bengalis who fled the genocidal attacks by the Pakistani military in 1970, 71. Right. And those who came in 71, the total was 10 million, which no other refugee crisis, not even the Afghan refugee crisis, comes close. So these 10 million people were given refuge willingly by India. No one asked them what their religion was. Yeah. That's how it has been. So it's really shameful that for the first time we have a government that judges people and their worth for protection and refugee status and citizenship on the basis of their religion. That, to my mind, is really a mirror image of what Pakistan was all about, and to my mind, should never have been allowed to darken India's political and constitutional system.
Now, you've put this in a bigger historical perspective, and that's great. That's exactly what I expected and wanted. Because I would like to approach it from my own perspective, being from an overseas Indian community in Trinidad and Tobago. We've been here for over 160 years. My family in particular has been here for 6 generations. We've established Indian communities in Trinidad, in Guyana, in Fiji in particular, Mauritius as well, where my wife is from. We're not just immigrants. We've actually created a land of our own and created sort of mini Indian, Bihari villages in a sense outside. But it was especially in Trinidad, Guyana, Fiji, it was a tough process. It was a lot of struggle, and I will tell you that from our experience, and V.S. Naipaul has written about this when he was in Africa and so forth. There was, when independence was coming, and if we achieved independence in 1962, there were a lot of fears about the rights of Indians in the independent countries. And we felt that Nehru abandoned us. We felt that Nehru made a statement in Parliament that the overseas Indian communities basically had to fend for themselves. They were in these other countries, and India had no place. And that was something really felt where the Indian communities felt abandoned. And I want to relate it also to something that Naipaul, our great writer Naipaul, had written when he was in Africa, traveling with Paul Tharoor, and going to Uganda and Rwanda and in East Africa traveling, and shortly before the Ugandan Asians were expelled and the Kenyans, but which he foresaw, and he was talking to the Indian community there, and he felt almost jealous next to Paul Tharoor and some of his English compatriots, saying they had governments who would look after them if they were in trouble. He, as a Trinidadian, as an Indian, felt he had nobody, and that if something, and he saw his American compatriots, if something ever happened to a single American, the U.S. government would not relent until that American was found, and it was just something that made him reflect and feel his nothingness in the world. You know how Naipaul is.
Interesting is that when he was a student in England, he had written to his father about thinking of sitting for the Indian examinations to join the Indian diplomatic service. So clearly, despite living and being brought up in Trinidad and never having seen India, he actually thought of himself as Indian, which is something perhaps people in India didn't fully appreciate. Nehru's position was actually legally accurate, because when you are sovereign independent states, it's only your own citizens you have any claim to. If an Indian citizen was in trouble abroad, the Indian embassy would obviously have to step in and help him. But an Indian who's a citizen of Trinidad, or of Fiji for that matter, it's very difficult for the Indian government to say somebody who's your citizen is my business. And to that degree, the stand taken by India was right. But there are some countries, China, for example, which has historically taken the view that once you're Chinese, you're always our business. And that is, in fact, resented by some Chinese who hold other passports, the Singaporean Chinese or the Indonesian Chinese, but welcomed by others who feel that the long shadow of China cast over unfriendly governments gives them some protection. So I understand your concern. I will say, though, that today our perception is slightly different in that we still associate ourselves more directly with expatriate Indians in foreign countries as overseas Indians. In other words, we don't quite see you as the same as Indian citizens, but we see you as people who have a special claim to our affections after our own citizens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know we have a limited time, but there are these large questions that this bill opens the door to, and which is about the reconfiguration of the world right now. It's definitely moving away, challenging the globalist sort of liberal consensus in international institutions, in domestic politics. So in so many places, India not being least among them, and what I am very interested in is your writings are very much part of that, I think, because you, for instance, the way you have questioned Winston Churchill, the place of India in global history, the role of colonialism, and you've even criticized your former employer, the United Nations, in the way that countries like India or Nigeria or South Africa or Brazil have been marginalized within the old order, which is still around, and which I believe that old order is the one being questioned right now. And in some ways, the BJP it's just like Trump is an imperfect attack on the old system of the G7 and the Security Council and NATO. BJP is an imperfect attack on the old system in a way as well. And you seem, from your perspective, so I'd like to hear how you reconcile that, because I think you have some sympathy with it.
No, look, I'm certainly beyond doubt critical of many things in the old system, whether the global system, certainly the colonial era. You're familiar with my work, and with some of the limitations, if you like, of old ways of doing things. But at the same time, I do believe there are some unchallengeable principles that should govern all human relations in any society. I don't think democracy, for example, is something that only a few can reserve to themselves. I think democracy is an ideal worth pursuing everywhere in the world, that people should have the freedom to determine their own political destinies, and people should have an opportunity to live and breathe free, to express their opinions, to pursue their own happiness. That is what, to my mind, democracy boils down to. I also believe that you should not be judging people by any attribute they can't help having. The color of their skin, their place of birth, their gender, their citizenship, their religious affiliation. 99 or 98% of the people in the world simply happen to be in the religion they were born in. Not very many people convert to go through a whole, philosophical epiphany. Some do, but most of them do. So to judge people by that, rather than by the content of their character, in Dr. King's famous phrase, by what they do, what they say, how they say it, that, to my mind, is terrible. There's some Hindus who are utter pains in the butt, as far as I'm concerned, and there are some Muslims or Christians who are very good friends of mine. Equally, absolutely, the same phrase would apply the other way around. And to my mind, the fact that they're Hindus or Muslims or Christians is much less relevant to me than that they're interesting, or that they're focused on a subject that I care about, or they're humane, or they've done good things, or they're successful in some way, or whatever. In other words, it's human characteristics that we actually relate to. We just like being around some people. The problem is with the BJP that they have taken a country that was built on that sort of principle, a country that seriously incorporated into its daily life and its political life a sort of live and let live approach, and they've made it into something much more narrow-minded and bigoted. That's what I object. I have no problem with the government, challenging all ways of doing things, from whether you want to stick to certain British conventions or practices. Why should you necessarily? To whether you want to have, let's say, a tax year the British established. Why can't you have a different tax year matching the calendar year, whatever? I'm very open to the government saying these are things that are better and more efficient. What I'm not open to, because that's where they cross the red line for me, is when they attack people on the grounds of religion, when they try and stifle free speech and dissent, when they try and take this very large and accommodative society and civilization and dumb it down or reinterpret it more narrowly into something it was never meant to be. I'll give you one very interesting thing that I've always valued in my life from Swami Vivekananda, who in his the same famous speech I cited a few minutes ago, he said, I'm proud to speak of a faith, speak on behalf of a faith, he was representing Hinduism at the World Parliament of Religions, that has taught the world not just tolerance but acceptance. Now, I read that as a teenager, and the more I've thought about it since, the more profound it seemed to me. I don't know about you, but I went to schools like many of my classmates in India where tolerance was taught as a virtue. A tolerant king was a good guy because he let other people be what they wanted to be. But when you think about it seriously, tolerance is really a very patronizing idea. Tolerance rests on the notion, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong.
Yeah.
Whereas acceptance, which is what Swami Vivekananda says Hinduism is all about, essentially says, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. And I cannot think of a better way of stating how important that kind of acceptance is, both of other religions, other ways of worship, other ways of being, but also in a democracy, other ways of thinking and other ways of having your own opinions. It's been a terrific strength of India that most Hindus have been like this. And it shakes me up to the core that a party that claims to be defending Hindu values betrays this fundamental value itself in its intolerance for others.
Yeah,
for minority faiths.
Yes, I mean, I understand that, and I mean, your book, Why I'm a Hindu, definitely speaks about that. And I mean, in my own understanding, because I am a Hindu as well, although I was raised a Catholic, we have my father's Catholic, my mother's Hindu, but I have, in my reconsideration of Hinduism throughout my life, I've come to the conclusion that the Hinduism is basically ancient Indian liberalism. And in a sense, this is why the Parsis could come. This is why these that it is
Jews
So
before that, and the acceptance given to Christianity. For
absolutely.
example, when Saint Thomas the Apostle showed up and started converting people. So there's
That's right,
always
and
been
you're Malayali, so you're yeah. So that is
that's
special for you.
right.
Yes, the
Yeah.
Jews. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the Jews, the Christians, the Parsis, and indeed even Muslims who came in peace were encouraged to practice their faith. The oldest functioning mosque in the world outside the Middle East, outside the Saudi Peninsula, really, is the one in Kodungalur in Kerala, which was established barely a few decades after the faith came into being.
Right, right. You see, and I think that I'm looking at it from a philosophical perspective, and you are in political battle, so I
True.
understand that difference. But there are aspects of Hindutva that I see look at that instead of adopting the British term liberalism and democracy, which brings it a special baggage with itself that can be un-Indian, if you want to put it that way, or contrary to
If you
Indian
like,
values.
in modern terms, Hinduism is liberal and Hindutva is illiberal Hinduism.
Right, right, right. So, right, the way that it's been manifested with certain aspects of thuggery and whatnot, I totally understand, and have absolute sympathy with you on that. But I do think that there are these large philosophical questions about nationalism and globalism. So, I mean, in your view, I do sense that you have a sympathy towards nationalism. And of course, you're part of the Indian National Congress, which inspired nationalist movements all over the Third World, including the Caribbean and elsewhere. But that's a different kind of nationalism than is occurring now. What is how do you define and defend nationalism in the current context? Because it is something different, isn't it?
Yes, I'm going to have to be brief, Kirk. We're running out of time. But
Yes.
very simply, the nationalism that India cherished was an inclusive nationalism. It basically said essentially what our nationalism is about is our self-respect, our right to determine our own fates, rather than having foreigners come and do it for us in our country. But once we've won our freedom, we have to include everyone, including those Brits who wanted to stay on were welcomed. There was never any hostility. In fact, Nehru was quite attentive to the sense that the British too deserved the respect for a peaceful transfer of power, and that's what happened. Well, it wasn't entirely peaceful from the point of view of the partition and the deaths that accompanied that, but I mean peaceful between the Brits and the Indian national movement. So my nationalism is one which includes everybody, in fact, which defines a nation by definition as including everybody. So I can never accept the kind of what the BJP calls nationalism, which is nationalism principally of, for, and by Hindus, and that too Hindus of a particular kind, rather than others, minorities, Muslims, and so on, are seen de facto in their minds as somehow less entitled to and less deserving of the position that Hindus can claim for themselves in India. Now, they argue, of course, look, there are so many Christian countries, there are so many Muslim countries. This is only the only country other than tiny Nepal where Hindus are a majority. Why shouldn't this be a Hindu country? Well, my argument is our history has made that impossible. Yes, Hindus are 80% of the population, but 20% of India is still 260 million people. You can't just wish them away, and you certainly can't relegate them to second-class citizenship. So that's the fundamental difference between my kind of Hinduism and their kind of Hinduism. But otherwise, I also don't grant them the sort of copyright over loyalty to the nation. I, in fact, rather enjoyed George Orwell's distinction between patriotism and nationalism, in that patriotism is love of your country because it's your country. You were born in it, or you grew up here, and you feel that it's the greatest place in the world because it's yours, and that's like loving your wife or loving your parents. To somebody else, they're not the greatest people in the world; their own parents are. But the fact is, that kind of feeling for your country is normal. Nationalism, he says, is something that's often and always, indeed, he argues, defined against somebody or something. So when you have nationalism against a foreign occupier, that's understandable. But when you turn your nationalism against people within your society, minorities, or particularly Muslims, or people who don't agree with you, or liberals, or whatever, then that nationalism becomes a dangerous instrument.
Yeah, so I definitely will appreciate this, and I respect that we have to cut this short. As a closing statement, instead of exploring it the way, perhaps we can do it another time, hopefully, but as a closing statement, what implications would you say this has, your view has, for India's place in the world as it's reconfiguring itself, like among the BRICS, among the challenges to the old system? How would you say your view? Because to me, this BJP nationalist view does have an implication that India should have some sort of leading role among nationalist countries or whatnot, whereas the global liberalist view sort of sees India as at least critics say that it puts India in a secondary position to the West. I'd like to hear your view.
Actually, this is the subject of my next book coming out next month. It's a co-authored book. It's called The New World Disorder and the Indian Imperative. But I've already written about this larger issue from a purely Indian perspective in a book called Pax Indica, which came out 7 years ago. Penguin has it, and I recommend it to you. But as far as the new book is concerned, I do look at the whole way in which global governance has worked since the Second World War, and I argue that it served very much the interests of a few dominant powers, particularly the richer Western powers, and that as new forces are emerging, of which India is one, you need a balancing force. You need something between, if you like, the extremes of the US and China on one side and the other, a state that is actually committed to liberal internationalism and at the same time wants to work with the people on both sides, is not interested in promoting hostility or difference amongst them. Now, that kind of approach, it seems to me, will give us a basis for a rewritten world order. Indians have been rule takers in the system, as have Trinidadians. And I think it's time some new faces join the rule makers. Equally, the challenge for a country like India to be on the high table of the world is particularly ironic because the powers that became, for example, permanent members of the UN Security Council were those who were the world's most powerful countries in 1945. Are they still? Does Britain and France carry the same inevitability of unavoidability as well that they had in 1945? What happened to Germany, which has outstripped them both? What about India? What about Japan? What about at least one of the African countries, Nigeria, South Africa, even Egypt? What about Brazil? What about Indonesia? There are lots of players whose voices are relatively marginalized. And one of the issues, therefore, is the need to rethink the global system and come up with a greater flexible thing. Because frankly, in international affairs, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think
exactly.
I think we've got to say that it's time that we move to the other side. I'll leave it there, Kirk.
Yes.
After it comes out and you've had a chance to look at it, we'll have a chance, I hope, to talk again.
I hope so. That's a brilliant segue.
If your viewers and listeners tell you they enjoyed this conversation, then we'll come back and have another one. Okay?
Absolutely. I want to thank you not only for this interview, but for all your work, your brilliance, your wit, and your charm. You're a rare personality, a politician that people can admire, respect, and genuinely like. I wish you every success in your mission ahead.
Thank you so much for those kind words, and have a great day. Take care.
You too. Thank you.
That's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, like, and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks, and bye for now.